Hello, this is Marie for Beattie-Powers Place in Catskill, New York. Thank you for joining us. Today we have a special program for you, Viva El Vedado, a documentary about an important and historic neighborhood in Havana, Cuba. The film presents the history of El Vedado from the last quarter of the 19th century to the Cuban Revolution. It introduces audiences to the neighborhood's remarkable architecture, its vibrant life, and the need for preserving El Vedado as part of Havana's heritage for the future. Right now, we have the filmmakers with us to introduce the film and provide a bit more context about its making. On that note, I'd like to welcome cinematographer and director Stanley Staniski and producer Mary Patricia Wilkie Ebrahimi. Mary and Stanley, could we start with you describing El Vedado a bit more? What makes it so special and what inspired you to make the film? We understand there's some personal connection there.
Shall I go first, Stanley?
I think you should, Mary, since it's more your neighborhood than mine. Although I feel it's my neighborhood now.
It is now after 3 years there. So I have no film background, and I do have a lot of background in Vedado. I grew up there and I lived there until I was 19 years old. And I was there on an architectural tour in 2015 with Secundino Fernandez, who's one of the voices in the film. And it brought back a lot of memories to me. And I thought, somebody needs to make a record of this. And I thought, oh, maybe a book, maybe photographs. And I thought, no, I don't really want to do a book. How about a film? But I don't know how to make a film. So I worked with Dino making a list of the 25 most important pieces of architecture in Vedado. And then I called up Stanley, who I knew socially, but had never worked with him before. And Vedado is located, it's a western suburb of Havana, but it's right up next to it. And it's a very interesting place because it was a planned city built on virgin land. And it presented a lot of problems in terms of doing a film because we had to get permits. But I'll let Stanley talk about his background, because if I had made the film, you wouldn't want to see it. So thank heavens, Stanley stepped in and helped me.
So one of the interesting things for me about Vedado is that it's and this goes to sort of some of the difficulties of working there and the challenges, is that it's a wealth of subject matter. I mean, there's just so much in Vedado that's interesting and it's exciting and historic. And I think a lot of people know Havana through old Havana and central Havana. And yet a lot of what we see of Havana is actually represented in Vedado. The opulent and grand sugar mansions, mansions that were built with sugar money, are in Vedado. The Havana Hilton, the Havana Libra Hotel, which is iconic, is in Vedado. The university is in Vedado. Meyer Lansky's former casino, the Riviera, is in Vedado. So Vedado has a lot of Havana history, but many people don't know that those buildings and those iconic images, many of them are actually in Vedado and not necessarily in old Havana. And a lot of them, Alarcón is in Vedado. So it's this really interesting, vibrant neighborhood. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about it. It's so varied.
Fantastic. And I understand that the film took about 2.5 years to film, which that must have been a process, I imagine, of going back and forth traveling. Can you describe a bit what was it like, the process of filming, and just your experience filming something over that period of time?
Well, there were a lot of challenges, but they weren't the ones I expected. I thought permitting would be a challenge, and we were given access to everything we asked for, except they did not let me fly drones up to the main avenues where we wanted to show how green and the green coverage that existed in Vedado. I'm told that now I could do it, but back in 2016, I couldn't get a permit for drones. You know, Stanley had the challenge of packing up his luggage and making sure he had everything. And then these huge overweight bills because he took everything except the kitchen sink, since he wouldn't be able to get anything once he got there. I think my biggest challenge was getting lunch hour for my Cuban crew to last not more than 1 hour. Otherwise, I had a very unhappy director. And that's pretty difficult to pull off in a Cuban restaurant with 9 Cubans chattering away, telling jokes, having a good time. And of course, I was enjoying it too. And Stanley doesn't speak very much Spanish. So, you know, after a while, he's ready to go. So we each had different challenges. I don't know, Stanley, what were yours besides packing?
I think we had one lunch that was an hour, and the rest of them were at least an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours. And I think there was one that was 2:20 or something. For me, the challenges really had to do with how do you get this neighborhood into a film? How do you represent it? As Mary mentioned, after a certain point, the permitting and access was not a problem. I think our handlers understood that we were doing a film that was about architecture, not about politics, a film that was about the people who live in the neighborhood and not about politics. And so representing Cuban culture and society and history and architecture is what we were up to. And so we had great access. We had fantastic access. Sometimes we'd have to go back to a building or a location again because we didn't quite get in where we wanted to the first time. And then the second time we were welcomed and we had much greater access. I think one of the other challenges for me generally was how do you know, we had rainy days. Actually, our first trip was over 2 weeks, and I think the first day was sunny and the last day was sunny, and otherwise it was rain. And so we'd have to shoot something. And the great part about going back over the 2 years a number of times is that something that might have been gray and rainy on one day, I say, you know what, let's go back and try shooting that again. And the sun's really pretty, or it's a different time of day. And so we solve those problems by, again, with the ability of going back and doing something again to make it look better, to make it look good. So.
I think one of the other challenges was I wanted to do it with a Cuban crew. I wanted to do the editing in the US with the editor that Stanley usually works with, but I wanted a Cuban crew in Cuba. First of all, I didn't want the expense of taking a whole lot of people there. And then I wanted people who were familiar with the area. And our sound man lived right up at 12th and 23rd. I mean, I think we had 3 or 4 of the people on the crew were actually Vedado residents. And that was really helpful. And we sort of, one person introduces you to another, and you get connected. I thought it was going to be very difficult pulling a crew together, and it wasn't at all. So we got lucky there.
And Mary, how many folks did you have on the crew?
If you count drivers and lighting people and somebody to sit and guard the equipment, I think there were 10 on the first trip. I think we had a crew of 10. Yeah, that sounds
Okay.
about right.
And so aside from weather and trying to find a crew on the ground, were there any other challenges that you would mention, either in getting the film set up or in its actual filming or in uh, post-production? Any other challenges you would mention?
I didn't have any. All the post-production was Stanley's.
uh, um, let's see. We were. It's not that we were. It's not that we were lucky. I mean, again, it goes back to my first comment about having sort of a wealth of material. The one of the Mary mentioned that initially she worked with Dino coming up with a list of buildings that were important in Vedado. And
Secundino Fernandez, he's an urban planner and an architect, and he grew up in Cuba also.
and he lives in New York and Miami. Okay. And that list was big to begin with, and it continued to grow. It would grow because we would see things that relate to that list. Say, oh, we have to add that to it, or that's a good example. Or we'd be roaming around, and Mary would say, oh, look at that, look at that. Let's put that on the list. And so it kept growing. And then we realized early on that if it's just a list of buildings, then after about the third or the fourth or the fifth building, then it is just a list of buildings. And so figuring out how to bring this neighborhood to life was what became an issue. How do we make it as interesting to an audience as it is to us? Okay. And Mary sent, this is, I can't remember what sort of precipitated the crisis, but Mary sent, it was late one night, because we're on in different time zones. Late one night, she sends me this letter. I hope you're sitting down when you read this. And it was this diatribe against something, and I can't remember what it was. But in it, she said, what I really want to do is I really want to show off the neighborhood that I grew up in and how special it was. And to me, that was kind of the breakthrough. Is it really said, okay, this is about the character and quality of this neighborhood and not just the buildings. And so what that did was it prompted us to start looking at the people who were there. You put people in these buildings because those people have the same feeling that Mary had and has for the neighborhood. They love it. You'll see in the film that we talk to lots of people in Vedado, and they get excited when they're describing their neighborhood. Or sometimes when we're in Old Havana and we'll be talking with somebody and say, oh, we did this film on Vedado, and they say, oh, I grew up in Vedado, and they're proud of it. It's like people from Brooklyn, they like to say that, I'm from Brooklyn, not Manhattan. And so that made the film what it is trying to figure out how to celebrate the joy and interest that people have and pride that people have in this neighborhood.
Wonderful. Yeah, and kind of followed the story in unexpected directions, I suppose.
Right.
Great. And Stanley, so I understand you have experience filming all around the world. I noticed Mozambique, Thailand, Egypt, Ghana, other places. After all those experiences, how would you compare? How would you compare? What are some things that struck you about filming here compared to all the other places you've been?
I'm often asked that, and of course, Cuba's the best. How can I say anything else? Actually, all those other filming in all those other places, in some ways, prepared me for being able to work in Cuba. It is very different. It is very unique. It's very special. We have friends that there now that are almost like family, and that's something that is very unique and again special. I hate to make the comparison. It's impossible to.
And Mary, what was it like for you? I understand you grew up there until you were 19, but and it sounds like you did not return for many years. Or what was it like for you to return?
I didn't return for 38 years, but I returned for the first time in 1998. So I had been visiting Cuba. I had just never really paid that much attention to the architecture. And as I got older, I was trying to communicate to my children what it was like growing up there. And I took both of my children and their families in 2015 on a tour. And that's when I really spent time in Vedado. And I looked around and I thought somebody has to record all this before it disappears. Well, I couldn't find somebody to do it. So I thought, well, I'll make an attempt at it. But I had been going back. I had been very connected with Cuba. I had been doing lobbying of the Obama government to try to free up travel to Cuba. So I was very interested in having engagement with Cuba. I hadn't been that separated. I was until 1998. And after that, I really became more engaged with the country again.
Okay, thank you. And that might segue into our last couple questions. I wanted to ask you a bit about where you see the future of this neighborhood going. Obviously, the documentary touches on questions of restoration and development, questions that are never far away when it comes to topics relating to architecture and urban planning. So perhaps referencing some of that, could you describe what are some of the challenges that you folks see facing El Vedado?
I think there are really two challenges. I mean, I don't know about the restoration, and that will depend on what the government does or what people are able to do privately. I'm not very optimistic right now. The Cuban government has a lot of economic challenges. They're not going to be restoring much in Vedado. But global warming is probably the biggest challenge the neighborhood has, at least the part close to the ocean, because in the winter the waves come over, there's constant flooding. Stanley was lucky enough to film some of it at one point, and we used a small section of that. But if you think of it, the seawall encloses a lower area. So when the waves come over, they come over and they sit in that lower area, and they flood the entire area. There are a lot of buildings that, if nothing is done, I don't think the lower levels would be inhabitable very long. And then you have the threat of bad urban planning, which there seems to be a lot going on since we finished the film. There have been 2 new high rises that have been built up in blocks right in front of the ocean. And this blocks the ocean views, it blocks the ocean breezes. And really, they should have some kind of a rule of keeping lower level buildings closer and putting the taller buildings further back. But those are the challenges I see. I don't know, Stanley, you probably have others.
Yeah. You know, in order for a city to succeed, and I come to this, you know, as a filmmaker, not as an architect or an urban planner, but all of the people that we've talked to and all the reading and research we've done, it says that, you know, a city needs to continue to evolve and grow, otherwise it dies. Being able to have Vedado and Havana continue to evolve and grow without damaging what's there, making sure it's preserved and protected is the key. And as Mary says, you know, it really is this kind of balance between growth and preservation. And that preservation isn't just keeping something as it is, but allowing it to you know, buildings to be used for other purposes. And there's a number of buildings in Havana and Vedado that are no longer used for their, you know, their initial purposes, but are changed to something else. But the buildings themselves, you know, on the exterior look very much the same. And so it's very possible. And that happens in places like New York and in Paris and Istanbul. And so it's, you know, it's very possible, but it's difficult to do.
Okay. And kind of wrapping up, I'd love to ask you folks if there's what your next projects might be, if there's anything that you'd like to mention or what you've gotten into following the documentary. Are there other current projects or future projects you're working on that you would care to mention?
So I think it was about 30 seconds after we had finished Vedado, and Mary said, "Oh, you know, let's make this film about colonial architecture in the 7 original cities of Cuba." So that's what we're doing, and I'll let Mary describe that.
We started in 2019 because we had done a little bit of traveling. I had been to Trinidad, and then we took this tour of basically the first 7 colonial cities of Diego Velázquez. And I thought, look at all this colonial architecture that's here that I didn't know about, so I'm sure a lot of other people didn't know about it either. And I came up with the concept of touching on all 7 cities, and we wrote in for the permit, and it was given to us, and we were assigned to the historian's office in Havana. We had to give a presentation to Dr. Eusebio Leal, the late historian of Havana. And then we, through another friend, we met Alicia Garcia Santana, who's a well-known colonial architecture historian. And we've all been working together since 2019 and took off a year for the pandemic. And Stanley and I hope to go back in November to do Baracoa and Bayamo. We've already completed Camagüey and Santiago de Cuba. So we're well on the way, probably another 2 years.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay, well, we'll mark our calendars for 2023, I guess. Yeah.
Don't mark your calendars. Things always take longer than we think.
Okay, great. Well, lastly, I'd just like to share a call to our viewers, a call for comments. The filmmakers have requested that you share your comments, questions, critiques, positive, critical. Please share them. We'll set up a mechanism so you can do so, but they're very much interested in hearing your feedback on the film. So after that, I'd just like to thank our filmmakers, Stanley and Mary, again, for being with us today and for sharing this great film with Beattie-Powers Place. And we hope that you enjoy. Thank you, both of you, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.